Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
I really hesitated to write this video. See, I posted a poll on Twitter secretly, hoping that people would pick a different game. Doing a video essay about System Shock 2 is something that I kind of dreaded. And it's not because I hate the game, it's actually quite the opposite. See, there's something oddly satisfying about starting a new game and having to restart because the build I chose ended up sucking and I got stuck at some point. But another part of me recognizes that other part of me, the part that realized that this game truly isn't for everyone, you know? And being me, I couldn't just let that go without talking about it, so. See, I knew that there's a certain segment of the public who would get very upset if I ever said anything bad about this game. But objectively, there are some things that aren't optimal, right? So, you know, after the month that I've had, I wanted to really just kind of like take it easy and maybe play Thief, do a video about a subject I really love, and at least go another month without reading a bunch of bullshit from angry internet people. Right? But fuck it, am I right? I mean, how do you know if you're even alive if you don't experience a little pain, right? So System Shock 2 is the kind of game that I would make if budget wasn't an issue, you know, but it isn't a game without issues. The upgrade system in particular gives you the impression that it allows you to pick a style from 3 choices and just run with it, but in reality,
you need to diversify your bonds, nigga.
If you stick to, let's say, the OSA path, you'll find yourself quickly one-shotting guys with a fireball, but by the time you get to the radiation-drenched maintenance level, you'll be out of psi hypos, hopelessly beating things with a wrench. Now, in order to do well in System Shock 2, you must craft a playstyle by picking and choosing from the seemingly endless list of skills and stats to create a character that you can improvise your way out of danger. On paper, it sounds amazing, but done the way that System Shock 2 does it can really drive a new player away. And that is System Shock 2 in a nutshell. Really, it's a deeply satisfying but deeply flawed experience for newcomers. So while the rest of the internet may be singing the praises of this game in the forums and YouTube, let's talk about what makes the game great and what makes the game, well, not so great. So let's dig in, shall we? First off, let's tackle the first big bugbear I have with the game and get it out of the way. The fact that you can make a build very easily that doesn't work. There's a very good possibility that you could upgrade yourself into a hole, and once you have completed a very big chunk of the game, you find out that the only way forward is to start over again. I mean, for the veteran player, this isn't such a big deal, but for the beginner, it sucks, and it's probably why some players will end up quitting. Imagine getting through a whole huge chunk of the game only to find out that your psi-only build has resulted in you running out of hypos and has got you running past turrets hoping that you'll find a hypo soon, and because you invested no points in any other combat skills, your only usable weapon is a wrench. You're gonna die. Not only are you gonna die, but you're gonna run into a wall through which you cannot proceed. In fact, the only good build in this game is a build that is diversified across all 3 disciplines. Now, I could be very wrong about this, so take what I say with a grain of salt, but hack is a must-have skill. I mean, you need it to beat the game, or an item, but enough about that. Ammo is gonna be very limited, and in the early decks of the game, so are psi hypos. This will severely gimp your character if you're unable to hack crates and replicators. So that means you have to spend quite a bit of cyber modules, the game's upgrade currency, on skills that are not combat related. Not only do you have to upgrade hack, but you also have to upgrade to cyber stat as well. There's even a mandatory research section. You have to do all of this while balancing and saving some modules for combat skills, endurance upgrades for health, and so on. The best thing about this system is that it inspires experimentation. The downside is that experimentation requires several new games, which can feel like an absolute grind to some people. For my money, a respec option should have been added. Some people might think this is a cheap and easy way to lead people to gaming the system, but listen, there are ways to balance these things. Make them a one-use kind of thing. one or two of these in the game would have balanced it out a bit more, so people who like to experiment would actually be able to without turning new players off from the game from the very start. The reason I'm harping on this so hard is because gamers have changed. It's not entirely their fault though. We have been conditioned over the years to accept games that will hold our hands, that a game should never abruptly end or force me to restart because of something I did or because of a choice I made. Yeah, it's my fault, but I gave you money, so give me entertainment. And yeah, it sounds childish, but they have a point. Modern gaming, unfortunately, has entitled the player to feel like they are not responsible for their own actions, and as a result, I'm afraid that new players wanting to get into this game will be turned off by the hard wall coming if they don't read, plan, and act according to the game's rules. Part of this is a lack of signposting in the game itself. You do not know on your first playthrough just how rare items are going to be, or the fact that you can farm the first deck for nanites. Now this might not be obvious, but this is a game that must be experienced, if not for the fact that it inspired all those other games that people love so much. More on that later. Another possible solution to this problem is actually behavior related, and could have been more elegantly solved through a change to the game's level design. The first problem we have is that upgrade stations come way too early. They should have been axed from the very start and only allowed the player to upgrade once he got to the crew deck. The reason I say this is because the player would have had much more time with their skills and would get a feel for how rare certain items are and how often enemies will spawn into a level. Removing the upgrade modules from the start gives the player more time with the game. That way, when they get to an upgrade station finally, they'll have a better idea of what will work with their build and what won't. You teach the player through the design. See, you're going to come across a lot of stuff on that first deck, like hacking a crate, researching monster parts, modifying weapons breaking, etc. The first level gives the player a lot to think about, and having all those modules saved up would give the player a really good idea of what path he is taking, without the regret that they'll probably feel when they find out that they've wasted their starting modules. This gives the player an idea of what they could do to stretch out their supplies, and they also know how scarce items are going to be. It prepares them better without needing to adjust anything else, so the skill system is fine, it's the level design around it that needs adjusting, at least in my opinion. Now what I like about the system is that you could play through the entire game 3 times and not see all that the game has to offer in terms of skills, especially with the psionic line, but also research, modification, and so on. The skills in this game are unparalleled by today's standards, as each one, by virtue of upgrading, being a rare treat that the player gets to partake in, picking one skill over another is an agonizing decision if you're not prepared with a spreadsheet. So what happens is, for instance, you decide to take a psionic ability that keeps your weapons from degrading, because you figure, yeah, I'm going to use this ability all the time and invest in psi and weapon skills. And you can do that, and if you're smart about how you play, you can get through the game that way. Or if you go the boring route and just jack of all the game and do pretty well with smartly picked skills, but that is the point. The game rewards the inquisitive player. It does that with its skills, and it does that with exploration. If you go through the game without exploring, which I guess is possible maybe, I've never done it myself, but that is because I'm having fun finding stuff. There's something oddly satisfying about finding an item in a crate, or in a desk, and the Scarcity of Items gives you that rewarding feeling. This is how you create in game terms need. See, with most systems, what you get is a stat increase, and while that may be a bit rewarding, that type of reward gets old really quick because we've seen this weapon. It works the same way that every weapon of this type has worked before. The sword swing is the same, or the gun fires the bullets the same, and so on. This feeling is even more common in games with a million pieces of armor. By our 10th set of armor, we're no longer rewarded. It almost becomes a chore because you get it so often and are having to go into your inventory to check its stats. At the end of the game, I don't know about you, but I don't even check anymore because why bother? But if you get an item that you have so few of and know you're going to need it later on, it means something. You get a health hypo and system shock too, and it's like, hallelujah! I ain't gonna die today, no Lord, not today.
Thank you for choosing Value Wrap.
But you get to keep all that emotion inside of you because your roommates don't like loud noises. But inside, you're so relieved. This game actually relieves tension, albeit tension it has induced, but tension nonetheless, The level design is great. Yes, you get lost. Yes, the minimap is off by default, but listen. Getting lost is your fault. The game is pretty straightforward with the exception of maybe the coolant tunnels. See, this area is great by itself, but there's far too much backtracking.
The many demands the termination of this exchange. We regret any inconvenience.
So let's talk about the backtracking a little bit. So you find a door in the tunnels, but the door is sealed because there's a coolant leak. Great. So you get yourself lost in the tunnels, but eventually you find your way to the next area. Here we're supposed to go to the cargo bays to find a code that some dumbass changed blocking our way to the coolant control center. So we go looking, we lose a bunch of our life, and when we find the code, we go to the computer and find out, oh yeah, you need to go to the storage closet back in the coolant tunnels and grab a part, then come all the way back here and install it. This kind of backtracking is awful. It's boring. It does nothing but pad out the runtime of the game. And if I had to say something bad about the level design, it's this. Most of the time, the levels come down to hunting down the item that goes in a thing that lets you keep going up the decks to the top. This game isn't about its combat, even though there is a ton of it. No, this game's about solving problems and navigating the areas. The game is at its best when it's laid out like a puzzle, and it's at its worst when it just has you going zone to zone to find X item to go into X thing. And you will get lost, and to a point, getting lost is your fault. It's hard to concentrate on what you're doing when you're trying to manage the sounds that are going off around you, reconciling your sense of orientation while trying not to get freaked out by the violent sounding horror show that waits behind every corner. Honestly, can we stop for a moment and consider a thing? They are remaking System Shock 1 in Unity, but a remake of System Shock 2 is probably another 5 years away. Can you imagine these creatures modeled now by a AAA studio that could manage to keep its dick in its pants and not redesign the levels or anything? Just graphically overhaul the fuck out of it, make it look shiny. My god, can you imagine? Dreams exist, people, and they can happen. Anyway, back to the levels. They're laid out like you might see in a real ship, at least if you squint really, really hard, they look that way. And a lot of them are dead on what I imagine, like the cargo hangars with the different storage halls stacked on top of one another. That's a great layout, and they even managed to create a maze-like structure out of the path between storage containers. Or how about the way they choreographed their jump scares? There's a part in this area that made the younger me scream like a little girl. You come down this hallway and you see these storage containers with robots in them. Now these little guys, they may seem helpful, but that's just a facade. You see, they blow you up, okay? You enter this hallway into this place and these robot bastard containers are everywhere. So you get to a floor where there are 6 robot containers and you go looking for treasure. And just about as you're about to turn that corner and search a container, you hear one of the metal crates behind you breaking. And the sound of your helpful friend from earlier coming to search for you so he can help you explode. I didn't have hard stool for like a week after this. See, the method the game uses to scare us, it's a technique that is as old as time itself. Alright, well maybe not time, but since the visual storytelling method came into its own. First you introduce us to a premise. In 7, the detectives are about to enter the building they believe John Doe to be living. SWAT enters first, and several loud kicked-in doors later we hear someone yell, "There!" In System Shock 2, this moment comes when we first meet our robot helper, and it chases us down to blow us up. We know that these robots are not our friends now. We meet another robot on our way to our next destination, the cargo bay, and now we're primed to fight more. We enter the next room. In 7, the detectives enter and see a room littered with car fresheners hanging from the ceiling so numerous the detectives must push past them to proceed into the next room where they find a man, emaciated, dead-looking, his skin waxy, his face drawn and tight. The SWAT leader leans in to get a better look at the dead man and says, "You got what you deserve." And somewhere in our subconscious we wonder, is this guy dead? Then in System Shock 2, we enter the hallway and see that it is filled with tanks that look like cryotanks, but instead of seeing people inside, we see robots. The same robots that blew us up from earlier. Not a good omen, friends. We can't help but wonder if they might pop out at any moment. And in 7, the seemingly dead man pops to life, coughing, struggling, seizing up like a madman thrashing about on the bed. Our adrenaline only stops flowing when we see the detective react to the scare outside of the apartment. In System Shock 2, a robot pops out at us just as we are at our most vulnerable, and our pants only unshit themselves once we have killed the robot or been blown up by it. If we survive, we get to stare at the containers that have not yet opened and wonder if we have to fight more. It's an old trick, but it's one that works. Show us a thing that might happen and pull on that string of tension until it's about to snap, then pow, it happens. That game made the younger me come to the edge of shitting my pants several times, and that is due to the tension and perfectly placed jump scares. But the other thing that helps is the scarcity of items. If you play this game the way I play it, which is that I don't save for long stretches at a time, you get really careful with your playstyle. Because if you die, you might be looking at losing 10 to 30 minutes of gameplay. Now, a betting me would be willing to say that this is the same engine that Thief ran on because of the audio, and if I did bet, I would win. Both games ran on a dark engine, an engine that would be released to the public in 2010, an action that as far as Wikipedia is concerned is still under review from lawyers. The audio is crisp, and I get the same feeling from this game that I got in the chapel back in Thief, but with the added creep factor of the doubled and pitch-shifted moans of the collective. Just look at the enemy models. A worm crawls into their heads and controls them, sends them telepathic messages from the hive mind, controlling their nervous systems at the root of thought, the brain. The body horror for its time was incredible. It was as if Looking Glass was tapping into a Cronenberg-esque vision of cyberpunk. It conjured images of Videodrome in my head, and this was also, again, to my knowledge, the first FPS horror game which had the survival element before survival horror was every game coming out on Steam. In fact, the first System Shock did a similar thing, albeit a clunkier playing version of it. I still remember suffering from cold sweats when I would run out of my favorite ammo in the first game. The story in System Shock 2 is told to you in a method that is now a go-to trope for just about any story-oriented first-person shooter, that is through voice-acted lines which either play over a radio transmission or an audio log left behind by someone who's no longer alive. Fragments of the past. These audio transmissions are our only link to what happened to the crew of this ship. This is a technique that many players will have first encountered maybe in BioShock, as it has become the most popular game that features it. Those of us that have encountered it here first will be familiar with the style of visual and audio storytelling on display here. First, we find an audio log that foreshadows a happier time. We see the character's face, we hear their voice, and eventually at some point later on in the game we get to see how they died. And now every time we hear their voice from there on out, we are hearing the voice of a ghost. So with a combination of sight and sound, System Shock 2 managed to keep me enraptured throughout the playtime, and coming back to it after all these years was surprisingly easy. Even though I still had to replay the game twice before I found a build that works, I still thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. It makes me lament the passing of a game studio that emphasized art over profit. It's just too bad you can't run a business that way. This has been a rant from Strat-Edgy, and now that you've heard it, go play some video games.